Look at those new collars. I'm not sure about them. That's Claire Pride in the newsroom. It's time now for the France 24 debate. When Egypt's army overthrew the country's Muslim Brotherhood-backed president in July, lawlessness and terror attacks in the Sinai were listed as a major reason. Well, since then, those attacks have become almost daily. This Wednesday, a car bomb killing 11 off-duty soldiers. Past attacks have been claimed by radical Islamists with purported links to Al-Qaeda. Army and police also being targeted in the capital. Polarization amid Egypt's anti-Islamist crackdown? Or does the Sinai have its own very specific issues? Under the terms of the Camp David Treaty, the Sinai, which was returned to Egypt by Israel in 1982, is supposed to be demilitarized. But with Israel's blessing, troops have gone in, and since the coup, authorities have returned to intermittently shutting the main border crossing with the Gaza Strip. Finally, does the violence justify what critics bemoan as the heavy-handed return of security forces to the streets, as witnessed Tuesday evening when 2 pro-revolution activists were killed in clashes with riot police? Today in the France 24 debate, the Sinai powder keg, and with us to talk about it from Cornwall in England, Omar Ashour, Director of Middle East Studies at the University of Exeter. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. We welcome to the show from the Middle East Institute in Washington, Mohammed El-Menshawi, columnist. Welcome to the show, sir. Columnist for Israeli daily Yediot Aronot Gil Mehaly is with us as well. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, let's first go to Cairo and to correspondent Catherine Stapley. Catherine, this Wednesday's attack on a bus carrying off-duty soldiers, similar to the one back in August that targeted off-duty police. Who done it and why?
Well, according to the Interior Ministry, there were 2 suicide bombers driving a car that rammed into a bus early this morning. And this bus was part of a convoy of Egyptian army conscripts. They were headed home to Cairo on leave. And I think the fact that this was a suicide attack certainly seems to be a new development from what we've been seeing before in this region. There have been frequent attacks on police and soldiers in this area, but they've always been roadside bombs and not suicide bombings. Now, today, the target was soldiers from the 2nd Field Army. Now, they've been doing most of the fighting against the Islamic militants in the region who've been waging a continuous insurgency there. But we have to stress no one has yet claimed responsibility for today's attacks. But it is the deadliest since mid-August, when gunmen attacked a convoy of security forces and 25 policemen were killed. And the authorities are saying they're fighting a war on terror there in Sinai, and they've stepped up military operations there. And there is a Sinai-based militant group, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. They've claimed responsibility in the past for a number of attacks in the Sinai as well as in Cairo. They've said they've assassinated a high-ranking intelligence officer in Cairo on Sunday, and they also said they were behind a failed suicide attack on Egypt's Interior Minister in September. So there are fears that an Islamist insurgency could take hold beyond the Sinai Peninsula, but it's still not clear who carried out this morning's attack.
All right, we'll go into that issue of who are these Islamists. But let me just ask you, Catherine, we called up at the beginning of the show a map showing the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, it is such a strategic location.
It is indeed a strategic location. You've got the border there with Gaza, and also it borders onto Israel as well. So it is a very strategic location and has been very, very difficult to control for many years. Under the ousted President Hosni Mubarak, there was a lot of military activity that happened there. They tried to keep the tribes and the militants under control there. But then when the next ousted President, Mohamed Morsi, came to power, he kind of let that slide somehow and try to do some kind of behind-the-scenes dealing with those Islamic militants, let them get on with it. But certainly since he was ousted from power by the military on July 3rd, the Islamic militants in the northern Sinai region have stepped up their attacks. And as we said, they're attacking police and soldiers on practically a daily basis now.
Catherine Stapley, many thanks for that update from Cairo. Omar Ashour, who are the players in all of this in the Sinai Peninsula?
It's a very, very complex situation. On the one hand, you have multiple security agencies that were operating in Sinai since the 2000, especially after the second Intifada, where you saw a rise in the Sinai-based activism, mainly in support of the Palestinian Intifada, because, as you know, the borders divides tribes and divides clans. So you saw there a competition, multiple actors, security sector, state security institution was a dominant player, but also the general intelligence and the military intelligence were there. And then you saw multiple stages of repression, followed by episodes of political violence between 2000 and 2000. Started the repression between 2000 and 2002, and then another cycle of repression violence, 2004, 2006. And then the latest episode was between 2010 and now.
Omar, are these militants? Omar, let me ask you: are these militants natives of the Sinai, or do they come from elsewhere?
It's a mix, but mainly natives from the Sinai, but also a lot from the Canal Zone area, and even some from the Delta and from Cairo that joined in at a later stage. But you have four names that came to the fore in the confrontations post January 2005, to 25th, sorry. You had the Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which is the supporters of Jerusalem. Also, you had the Shura Council of the Mujahideen close to or near Bayt al-Maqdis, near Jerusalem. You also had the remnants of the Tawheed wal Jihad, which is one of the organizations that operated in 2005 and came to the fore, and was one of the groups that was able to transform some of the ideological literature from readings and tapes and the literature into an actual organization operating in 5 districts in Arish, in the middle of Sinai, in Halal Mountain, and Ismailia as well. And then after, so the remains of this organization, that organization between 2004 2006 was pretty much destroyed to a large degree, but the remnants of it are still around there. And then you have the so-called, between quotations, the Salafi jihadi current, which is more of an ideological current as opposed to an actual organization. But in the middle of this also, there are multiple other apolitical organizations that carry arms, mostly for smuggler activity, criminal activity, and so on. And sometimes the lines are very blurry, and the competition of the security services as well. You don't seem to have one clear actor operating in Sinai. So it's a very complex situation.
Mohammed Al-Manshawi, let me ask you the question. Why do you think we're having this escalation that we've witnessed, where attacks in the Sinai, of course not as spectacular as the one we saw this Wednesday, but attacks are now almost on a daily basis?
Actually, there is no single reason to understand what's going on in Sinai, but several reasons. Among them, Northern Sinai gave President Mohamed Morsi 63% of the vote in the second round of Egypt free presidential election last year. He got 52% all over Egypt, but he gets 63% in Northern Sinai, and he has a big follower and loyalists there. That's one. Second, the extremist militant, which I completely agree with our first speaker, we don't know exactly who are they. They believe the ousting Islamic president is a threat to them, existential threat. It means for them returning of heavy-handed repression by the military and the police, which it was lessened in last year or two. And the return of repression for them is not acceptable anymore after revolution, after the collapse of the police, during revolution days against Mubarak. And the return of the state police to Sinai is not acceptable anymore by their standards. And I believe we can't ignore the fact that some tribes in northern Sinai are very much connected to Palestine and to Hamas, and they don't recognize the international borders. And they see crackdown in tunnels and smuggling is existential threat to them, and therefore they take arm against the state. But in the bottom line, the way Cairo and Cairo elite and the regime in Cairo ignored Sinai in the last 3 decades is responsible for what we are witnessing now.
Gilman Haley, seen from Paris, this the story resembles a little bit what we saw in the Sahara, isn't it? Where a remote area ignored by the central authorities, where there's a mix of militants with an ideological agenda and bandits.
Yes, and I think that, like all other cases, as the previous interlocutor said, ever since Egypt got back Sinai in 82, it seemed to lost interest in this area. And what happened is that it became a kind of a political, administrational vacuum. For many years, it seemed like an intelligent, benign neglect. You let the Bedouins traffic drugs into Israel and then to Gaza, traffic prostitutes from Eastern Europe. But we know that the same networks that traffic human beings and drugs and illegal immigrants, they can traffic other stuff when the price is right and when the occasion is there. So as the Egyptian state became weaker, and especially after the revolution of February 2011, what was a kind of a weakness became chaos, and what we see today is the result of many decades of political errors and misjudgments. I would like to add two things to what was said before. First, for the strategical importance of Sinai, it's not only the fact that it borders Israel and Gaza. He who controls Sinai can close the Suez Canal. And you don't need a lot. You need to fire a few times on boats, even without hitting, and Lloyd's and the panic will do the rest. This is one.
But wait, before you get to your second point, let me just ask you on that. How worried are the Israelis on that point?
Very, very worried. Because for Israel, the most important thing is to be surrounded with states, which means with people that you know the number, you can call them, and even if they hate you, they control the territory, and you can talk to them, and they understand business. I mean, they understand this. They understand equilibrium of force. You can talk to them. As soon as an area becomes Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, the tribal areas in Pakistan, everyone is losing. Everyone is losing.
Is it an exaggeration, though, to put the Sinai in the same boat as Afghanistan?
Today, yes, but in 2 years, maybe not. Maybe it's an understatement. But I mean, what happened is that Sinai became a small tribal zone on the margin of the Egyptian state. So as long as the Egyptian state had power, the situation was controllable. There was corruption, there was trafficking, but violence was under control. As soon as the central state was weakened, it went out of control. And I want to add the second strategic point, that the people of Sinai already decided that Egypt will not sell oil to Jordan and to Israel through Sinai. They decided to close. I mean, when we talk about strategic importance, the Bedouins shut down the export of oil from Egypt to Israel and Jordan. It wasn't the decision of the Egyptian government, and 3 years later, the Egyptian government cannot do anything about it.
Omar Ashur, do you agree that Sinai is an Afghanistan in the making?
I don't think so, to be honest. We're not seeing a situation of the border groups that are armed and that are state supported in one way or another by an intelligence agency. We're not seeing the Hezbollah scenario on the south of Lebanon or the Lashkar-Taiba scenario on the borders of Kashmir, India, supported, at some point supported by the Pakistani government. We're not seeing, the Pankisi Gorge, in the north of Georgia, where Chechen fighters on this border region launching their attacks into Russia, and so on. We're not seeing that scenario. We're seeing mainly a peninsula that has its major developmental issues, political issues, and it's correct that since the return of Sinai, there was no policy towards it except crackdowns. It was a security problem for Cairo more than anything else. And most of the policies that were directed towards Sinai were security policies. There was no long-term investment in the region. There was no attempt to and limit its marginalization and to enforce institutionalization there, whether in the form of local councils or in the form of some serious investments, especially in the north. And there was no sensitivity towards the tribal factor and the clan factor there. And most of the crackdowns that happened, you saw the reactions to them a few months later or a few years later, and they're lasting. In 2011, when the revolution happened, you had many of the Sinai activists, even tribal leaders, most of them asking for compensations, asking to hold the ones that arrested their members of their families, members of the clan, members of the tribe for years to be held accountable, asking for more investments in the region, more employment in the region, more or less the long-term policies that should have been there since the 80s, but they were never there.
They were never implemented. The neglect continuing. I just want to say that we have on Facebook a comment from Ibrahim. A lot of people, it seems, believe that what's happening in Sinai has, as you've described eloquently, Omar Ashur, the issues specific to an area that's been under the radar for many decades on the part of authorities in Cairo, but a lot of people think it's about what's happening in the capital. Ibrahim on Facebook says, I think the attacks will stop if the Egyptian army reinstates the first ever democratically elected president in the history of Egypt. Radical militants, by the way, taking the battle to the capital. Early this Wednesday in the north of Cairo, there was an attack on a police checkpoint, wounding 4 policemen. On Sunday, gunmen killing a senior intelligence official, Lieutenant Colonel Mohammed Mabrouk. They fired on his car. Ansar Beit al-Makdis, that radical group that Omar Ashur was mentioning, claiming it was retaliation for the arrests of women protesting the military takeover. Mabrouk's colleagues striking a bitter pose at his funeral.
Of course, they started to focus on the inside, and they are willing to assassinate. There will be a series of assassinations in the future. He is survived by his 2 girls and 1 boy, all in primary school.
They've started to focus on the inside. Mohammed El-Menshawi, who's they?
I don't know. Violence is not new to Egypt, but Egypt state never were able to solve the issue of violence the way we are witnessing now. It's become a daily routine to have attack inside Egypt, inside Cairo, or in Sinai, or a remote area by Suez area, or in southern Egypt. It's a routine that we not used to deal with, and I believe it's kind of revenge of the military move to interfere again in politics. It sent a bad message to all political forces. A lot of people agreed to denounce violence, to join the political process. And here again, we see the military abort the whole democratic experience of Egypt. And it's unknown. It's made the future of Egypt to be dark and unknown. There is no way out. As violence will not solve any problem. Assassination of police officer will not solve any problem. Trying to eradicate Islamist and Muslim Brotherhood, to that matter, will not solve any problem.
When we come back, we're going to look at that spiral of violence, both in Sinai and in Cairo. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.